I trusted my wife and the pastor, but what I learned shocked me to the core. The video I found showed my pastor manipulating women, breaking their vows, and betraying their trust. And worst of all, I realized that my wife was a part of it. I decided to reveal the whole truth publicly. This is not just cheating. It was purposeful manipulation, and I cannot let it go unpunished. Church or pastor? The shocking truth about dark rituals and betrayal I uncovered. Kevin was sitting on the old leather sofa in the living room, flipping through his favorite car magazine. The evening promised to be quiet and cozy, just the way he liked it. Sarah had gone to the church for a meeting with the women's group, which meant a few hours of peace at home. He was lazily turning the pages when suddenly his gaze fell on a dark blue diary peeking out from under a pillow on the other side of the sofa. The diary was new, its cover smooth, with gold embossing. It didn't resemble the ones Sarah usually used for notes about work or shopping. Looking closely, Kevin noticed the edges were slightly worn, as if it had been opened frequently. "What's this?" he thought aloud. Curiosity got the better of him, and he carefully picked up the diary. On the first page, there was a neatly written date, a month ago. Opening the first entry, Kevin saw elegant lines. "Today, the pastor said that every soul deserves love, even if it's broken." His words touched me deeply. I no longer feel alone in this chaotic world. Kevin frowned. Sarah had always described her feelings in a reserved way, even in conversations with him. Another entry made him tighten his lips. "The pastor said I have a strong inner world. He wants to help me become the best version of myself. No one has ever noticed so much good in me before. I feel like I can trust him completely." Kevin read these lines several times. His heart tightened with an undefined, unsettling sense of foreboding. He kept flipping through the pages, each new entry stirring him more. "Today we talked again about spiritual connection. He said there is a special path for us, a path of purification. What does this mean? Who is we?" Sarah had never mentioned such personal conversations with Pastor Graham. In fact, he had always seemed like an ordinary man to Kevin, even a bit dull, a typical preacher with a soft voice and a constantly polished smile. Inside the diary, there was nothing overtly explicit, but the words Sarah used to describe these meetings felt too emotional. The entries became more and more personal until he came across the last one. His words about sacrifice made me think, am I ready to take this step? He said that sometimes sacrifice is the highest form of trust. Kevin stopped, feeling a wave of indignation rise within him. Sacrifice? What is this even about? His hands trembled as he closed the diary. At first, he wanted to put it aside and pretend he hadn't read anything, but the thoughts wouldn't let him rest. He tried to convince himself it was just women's fantasies or exaggerations, but deep down, he knew something wasn't right. Kevin stood up and started pacing around the room, trying to calm down. He accidentally knocked the coffee table, and a thin gold bookmark fell off. It wasn't a bookmark, but a small rectangular piece with embossing, "Purification, Wednesday, 7 p.m. "Today is Wednesday," he whispered. Too many coincidences. Sarah had said she would be at the women's club meeting today, but what was this purification? Kevin made a decision. He put on his jacket, grabbed his keys, and left the house. He needed to check what was going on. He knew exactly where the women's group meetings were held, but something told him that wasn't the place Sarah had gone. Instead, Kevin drove to the church, where Graham often held evening meetings. The parking lot was nearly empty. Only a few cars were parked under the dim light of the street lamps. Kevin parked nearby and decided to wait, watching. A few minutes later, he saw Sarah's familiar car pull up to the church. She got out, wearing an elegant dress that Kevin hadn't seen before. She looked very formal, as if preparing for an important event. Behind her, Pastor Graham got out of the car. He opened the door for Sarah and said something, making her laugh softly. The sound of her laughter struck Kevin harder than any words. They entered the church and Kevin, holding his breath, got out of his car. He approached closer, but the doors were locked. Through the stained glass windows, it was impossible to see what was happening inside. Suddenly, he heard the faint sound of the church doors opening in the yard. Someone stepped out and walked toward the side entrance. Kevin moved silently, trying to stay in the shadows. The closer he got, the stronger the anxiety gripped his heart. Kevin tried to follow the person in an attempt to enter the church, but it didn't work out. He realized that it was all too much and decided to head home. Kevin sat on the sofa, trying to distract himself by watching a TV show, but his thoughts kept returning to Sarah, her diary, and the meeting at the church. Why has she changed so much lately? He wondered, gripping the remote control. She used to be so different, light-hearted, open, sometimes even overly talkative. Now she seemed more withdrawn, as if she had become obsessed with something completely unknown to him. When Sarah came home, she was still wearing that elegant dress. She smiled at Kevin as though nothing had happened. "How was your day, darling?" she asked as she walked to the kitchen. "Everything's fine," Kevin replied, trying to maintain his usual tone. "How was the meeting?" "It was good as always," she said, taking off her shoes. "We discussed important topics about faith and service." Kevin watched her closely. She appeared calm, even satisfied, but something in her eyes revealed an inexplicable, deep mystery. "And what exactly did you discuss?" Kevin tried to probe. Sarah turned to him with a slight look of surprise. "Oh, various things. About how faith helps us in difficult times. The pastor said that sometimes we all need to seek a new beginning." "A new beginning?" Kevin pretended to be disinterested. "What does that mean?" "It's about purification, about letting go of what burdens us and moving forward," Sarah replied, opening the refrigerator. "You know, he's a very wise man." "A wise man?" Those words echoed in Kevin's head like an alarm bell. "And were there many people there?" he continued to inquire, trying not to reveal his anxiety. "Yes, many women, all so different, but united by the same faith. It's inspiring." Kevin decided not to press further. He knew that any additional hint might raise suspicions, and he needed to learn more on his own. Sarah continued her evening as if nothing had happened and went to bed early, saying she was very tired. Kevin stayed in the living room, reflecting on the situation. He was overwhelmed by a strange mix of jealousy, anxiety, and irritation. Something was definitely wrong, but he had no concrete proof. The next morning, when Sarah left for work, Kevin decided to take advantage of her absence. He took out her diary again, reading the entries more carefully this time. Words like sacrifice, purification, and new beginning now seemed even more suspicious. He noticed that several last pages were torn out. What was she trying to hide? He wondered. He began searching the house for other clues. In the closet, among her clothes, he found a small envelope with gold embossing. Inside was a note inviting her to some purification ceremony next week. The location, a private house outside the city. Kevin felt as though Pandora's box had just opened in front of him. This ceremony was not something ordinary. He took a few pictures of the note with his phone and put everything back in place. When Sarah came home that evening, Kevin acted calmly. He understood he needed to be cautious. His plan was to observe and wait until he gathered enough information. Over the next few days, Sarah behaved normally. She was friendly, caring, even a bit more energetic than usual. But Kevin couldn't shake the feeling that it was all just a mask. On the day of the purification ceremony, Sarah wore a white dress and told Kevin she was going to another women's group meeting. "Don't wait up for me late," she smiled as she left. "Of course," Kevin replied, hiding his true intentions. As soon as her car disappeared over the horizon, he quickly got into his car and followed. He knew this might be his only chance to find out the truth. Kevin kept a safe distance as Sarah drove out of town. Her car turned onto a narrow side road, leading to a secluded house surrounded by thick trees. Kevin parked by the side of the road and crept closer, hiding in the shadows. He saw Sarah enter the house with several other women. Pastor Graham greeted them at the door with a warm smile. Kevin circled around the house, looking for a way to peek inside to see what was happening. At the back of the house, he found a small window through which he could see a large hall filled with people in white robes. Sarah stood at the center while Graham spoke, gesturing with his hands. Kevin couldn't hear the words, but what he saw made his heart tighten. He decided to stay and wait until the ceremony was over to see what would happen next. He couldn't imagine that what he would witness later would change his life forever. But nothing happened. Kevin watched and waited for something, then realized he might be overthinking things. He trusted his wife, But all of this seemed very strange to him. Although Kevin believed in God, he didn't always attend church. For him, faith was something a bit different. When Kevin returned home, he entered the bedroom and noticed a box he had never seen before. Kevin stood in the bedroom holding the box, and when he opened it, he saw a bracelet. His heart tightened with a mix of emotions: surprise, anxiety, and uncertainty. For a special soul, the words on the bracelet sounded in his head like a verdict. He carefully examined the piece of jewelry, noticing a small scratch on the glossy surface. Suddenly, his attention was drawn to a small piece of paper that fell out of the box. It was a receipt. The jewelry store was located in the city center, and the salesman's name on the receipt was Kevin's old acquaintance Jake. A memory flashed through his mind. A couple of weeks ago, he had seen an advertisement for this store, which particularly emphasized that their products were perfect gifts for lovers. That phrase now sent a shiver down his spine. He looked at the bracelet once more. Sarah had never mentioned this gift. Kevin was sure it wasn't for him. His distrust grew. He stuffed the receipt into his pocket and decided to go to the store the next day to find out the truth. The next morning, he didn't rush into making that decision. Sarah acted like she always did, preparing breakfast and discussing plans for the day. "What are you planning to do today?" she asked with a smile. "Nothing special. Maybe I'll stop by Joe's to check on the garage," Kevin lied, hinting that he might work on his car. "Sounds great," Sarah said, not suspecting anything. "I also have a lot to do. I need to wrap up some work, and then I'll head to church." Church again, Kevin thought, trying to restrain himself from showing his irritation. As soon as Sarah left the house, Kevin immediately headed to the jewelry store. Jake greeted him warmly, like an old friend. "Kevin, it's been a while. How's everything?" "Hi, Jake, everything's good. You know, I'm not here for no reason. There's something you can help me with." "Always happy to help," Jake replied, rubbing his hands. Kevin pulled out the receipt and showed it to his friend. "This item was purchased here. I need to know who bought it." Jake raised an eyebrow, a little uncomfortable. "Well, you know, I can't disclose customer information. It's against store policy." "Jake, I understand, but this is important." "Very important," Kevin insisted. "Just tell me, do you remember who bought it?" Jake paused for a moment, then shrugged. "It seems it was about a week ago. I'm not sure, but I think it was a man. Very well dressed, maybe too much for this kind of store." "A man?" Kevin asked, feeling his heart stop. "Yeah. He left his number for delivery in case something went wrong with the order. But I can't say anything more." Kevin nodded, realizing the conversation needed to end to avoid looking suspicious. "Thanks, Jake. You really helped me out." When he got back home, Kevin couldn't find peace. His thoughts were scattered. Who is this man? Why is Sarah hiding this from me? And what's really going on? He decided to take action. Gathering his patience, Kevin began to plan how to find out more. In the evening, Sarah came home, as usual, with a smile on her face. She was too calm, as if nothing unusual was happening. "How was your day, darling?" she asked, undressing in the hallway. "Not bad," Kevin replied, trying to keep a neutral tone. "Listen, I'll be late tomorrow. We have another big meeting at church. The pastor is planning a special sermon, and I can't miss it." Kevin nodded, but an idea was already forming in his mind. The next day, he followed Sarah. She went to church as always, but this time Kevin stayed nearby, in his car, watching the building. He noticed several women entering, but what struck him the most was when, after 20 minutes, a man entered the church. He was in an expensive suit, exactly like the one Jake had described. Kevin sat in the car, gripping the steering wheel as if that could help him control his emotions. He realized that the situation was much more complicated than he had thought. He decided to wait until the end of the meeting to see who would leave with Sarah. He was ready to learn the truth, even if it was very unpleasant. Kevin sat in the car for a long time, wondering why Sarah was receiving such gifts, and she hadn't even told me about it. He saw Sarah leave the church with the strange man. They got into a car and drove somewhere. Kevin followed them and saw the man drop Sarah off at home, the same place where Kevin and Sarah lived. Kevin kept his distance and carefully observed. Kevin sat behind the wheel, watching Sarah walk along the sidewalk as the man drove on. His heart raced, and his thoughts were scattered. He decided not to get any closer to avoid arousing suspicion in Sarah. He stayed at a distance, keeping a close eye on her every step. With each passing minute, he felt his nerves breaking under the weight of the uncertainty. Why did she kiss him on the cheek? What kind of friendship is that? A gift that makes no sense in our family. And why has she never mentioned this man? Kevin thought. All of this was running through his mind. When Sarah got out of the car and went into the house, Kevin stayed for a few more minutes, processing what he had seen. His heart still felt the heaviness of the scene. He drove home, entered the driveway, and quietly turned off the engine. While Sarah went into the house, Kevin stood by the door, thinking about how to best talk to her. He didn't want to make hasty conclusions, but it was hard for him to control his emotions. He went inside, where Sarah was already lying on the couch as if nothing had happened. She tried to appear calm, but Kevin noticed how her gaze seemed a little distant and her smile not quite natural. "Where have you been?" Kevin asked, his voice sounding hurried but with hidden tension. "Who was the man who dropped you off?" Sarah looked at him in surprise, but her facial expression quickly changed and irritation appeared on her face. "Is this an interrogation? Why are you speaking to me like that? I can't even spend time properly without you accusing me of something." Kevin stood before her, trying to hold himself together. He felt the tension slowly rising. At that moment, he decided not to go to extremes and not to let anger take over, but it was hard for him to speak calmly. "I found this bracelet," he said, pulling it out of his pocket and placing it on the table in front of her. "And there's an inscription, for a special soul." "Sarah, what is this? And who is this man? What's between you two?" Sarah pressed her lips together, as if trying to avoid a direct answer. She grabbed the bracelet and looked at it, as if searching for words to justify herself. "It's a gift from a friend from church," she began slowly, as if carefully choosing every word. "He just gave me a ride home when I stayed after the meeting. It's nothing more than a friendly gesture, and I don't understand why you're jumping to conclusions. I owe him nothing." Kevin tried to calm down, but doubts were already creeping into his mind. "Just a friend?" he asked quietly, his gaze sharp. "A gift like that? And you never mentioned him before?" Sarah shrugged, trying to explain to her husband that it wasn't what he thought. She started talking again about her church, charitable events, and helping those in need, but Kevin felt that this was only part of the truth. His doubts grew. "Kevin, I'm not going to explain every gift I receive," she said nervously, hiding the bracelet. "You don't understand. It's just like that, nothing more." Kevin realized he should calm down and give her time to think, but he couldn't forget what he had seen and what had happened afterward. Something wasn't right. He needed more proof. He couldn't live with these unanswered questions. "Sarah, I just want to figure this out," he said in a soft voice, looking into her eyes. "If it's just friendship, why couldn't you tell me about it before? I don't believe this is just a coincidence." Sarah stood up, and her gaze grew colder. "You don't have the right to tell me who I can and can't talk to. You're accusing me of something I didn't do. This makes no sense." Kevin didn't respond. He understood that this moment would not lead to a constructive conversation, so he decided to act differently. If she wouldn't open up, he would find his own way to get to the truth. "I think we need some time to think," he said, turning to leave. "I'll stay calm, but I will find out what's really going on here." Sarah remained standing, watching him. Her expression changed, and Kevin noticed how her face became serious. "You won't be able to take it back," she whispered quietly. Kevin didn't respond. He just left the room, leaving his wife alone. In his mind, one clear thought echoed. He had to find out the truth, even if it cost him more than he could imagine. For several weeks, Kevin had been observing how Sarah was increasingly distancing herself from him. It hadn't happened abruptly, but gradually, he started feeling her withdrawing into her inner world. Her habits were changing. She spent more time at meetings, traveling to church, talking about spirituality, and often mentioned Pastor Graham. This had become an ever-present thought in Kevin's mind. Why had everything changed? Their life together was no longer what it had been. Sarah's indifference to Kevin was becoming more apparent. She no longer reacted to the little things that had once bothered her. And although Kevin didn't want to admit it to himself, He felt something was happening behind his back. His suspicions were gradually becoming stronger, and he realized he had to take action. One evening, when Sarah was preparing to go to another one of her church meetings, Kevin decided that this time he would go with her. He could no longer watch from the sidelines. He needed to understand what was really happening and perhaps uncover the truth. "Sarah, I'm going with you," he said when she was about to leave the house. She looked at him in surprise and then peered into his eyes. She seemed to waver between wanting to tell him something and wanting to avoid the situation. "Do you want to come to the sermon with me?" she asked, trying to hide the awkwardness in her voice. "Yes, why not?" Kevin replied, watching her reaction closely. Sarah slowly nodded and placed her bag on the table. "Okay, if you want to. Just be careful, not everything might be of interest to you." Kevin didn't pay attention to her words. He could no longer tolerate the silence. They drove to the church together, and the journey seemed very long to Kevin. His heart raced with each step toward the church because he felt that something wasn't right. Why was she so drawn to this world? The church was cozy, with stained glass windows that enhanced the atmosphere, and the scent of old wood filled the air. Kevin and Sarah got out of the car, and he noticed how serious Sarah looked. She led him to a place he had never thought of going before. They entered the hall, and as soon as they walked in, Kevin immediately noticed Pastor Graham. He was on the stage, and his deep, loud voice filled the space. The sermon began. Graham stood before them, dressed in a black robe with white embroidery. His eyes glowed with focus, but something in his gaze made Kevin feel uncomfortable. It seemed like he wasn't just looking at people, but rather peering into their souls. The sermon focused on the themes of atonement and sacrifice. Kevin watched every word carefully, and it seemed that those words carried some hidden meaning. Graham spoke about purifying the soul, repenting for one's deeds, and the need to sacrifice in order to receive forgiveness. To receive forgiveness, you must sacrifice what you value most, Pastor Graham said in his deep voice. Only through sacrifice can the soul be cleansed and peace be found. Kevin felt an uncomfortable sensation in his chest. These words were too heavy and seemed to carry some additional subtext. He wasn't sure, but it seemed that Pastor Graham was implying something more than just spiritual cleansing. Accordingly, Kevin's attention shifted to Sarah. She was sitting beside him, her face serious and focused. She didn't take her eyes off Pastor Graham and didn't look away for a moment. Kevin felt the tension growing in her behavior. He couldn't understand why she was taking every word from Graham so seriously. During the sermon, Kevin dared to ask a few questions. "Are you really interested in this sermon?" he asked quietly. Sarah simply nodded, but her face became even more tense. "What do you mean?" she asked, her voice strained, as if trying to maintain control over herself. Kevin couldn't help but notice how her fingers slightly trembled as she held her bag. He realized that there was something more to this situation than just spirituality. Everything seemed too strange. "You look a bit nervous," Kevin remarked, observing her reaction. Sarah pursed her lips and fell silent for a moment. Her gaze returned to Pastor Graham. "I'm just thinking about all of this. It's important, Kevin." Kevin couldn't shake his doubts. He glanced once again at Pastor Graham, who was continuing his sermon. His words were so powerful that even the atmosphere in the church seemed unusual. Kevin could no longer sit silently. He had to learn more. When Sarah and Kevin returned home after the sermon, Sarah began to act distant. She wanted to stay overnight at the church, but Kevin didn't want that. Kevin sat at the table, his eyes not leaving Sarah. He tried to stay calm, but his heart beat faster with every movement she made. For weeks, he had been observing her strange behavior, but why she seemed so distant, why her thoughts and emotions increasingly belonged only to the church, he couldn't understand. All these visits to Pastor Graham, her desire to stay at the church overnight, it was all too unclear and strange to him. "Sarah, why do you want to stay there?" Kevin asked. Sarah glanced briefly at him, her gaze lost in her thoughts. "It's important to me, Kevin," she replied quietly. "I feel like I'm spiritually fulfilled there, like it's a part of me. Pastor Graham is helping me get through this. He needs to be there when I go through these moments." Kevin felt his heart tighten at this response. He couldn't understand why Sarah had changed so much. She was no longer the woman he had met, the woman he had built his life with. Her words felt distant, as if she had become part of something else, something incomprehensible to him. But why is it so important for you to stay there? Why the church? Kevin couldn't calm down. Sarah seemed unable, or unwilling, to understand what troubled Kevin. She didn't even try to reassure him that everything was okay. She simply sat in silence, lost in her own world. That evening, Kevin went to bed with a heavy feeling in his chest. He felt uneasy. He couldn't find peace in his soul. The next day, Sarah left again for some meeting. It had become routine. She didn't explain where she was going, only saying it was important for her spiritual growth. Kevin realized he needed to take action. He couldn't sit at home and just observe anymore. He needed to find out what was really going on and why his wife had changed so much. So, he decided to follow her. He waited a while until Sarah left. She drove off in her old car, and Kevin followed behind. He tried to stay unnoticed, keeping a safe distance to avoid suspicion. The distance between them was large enough for him not to be noticed, but he kept his eyes on her the entire time. As usual, Sarah drove in an unknown direction, and Kevin had no idea where she was heading. Eventually, Sarah arrived at a hotel on the outskirts of town. Kevin realized he couldn't just let this go. He got out of the car and slowly followed her, trying not to attract attention. He walked slowly, watching her every move. Sarah entered the hotel and disappeared through its doors. Without thinking, Kevin followed her. He knew he had to be careful, but his heart was racing, and he couldn't afford to back down now. He took out his phone, took a few steps to the side, trying not to look suspicious, and continued following her. He saw Sarah meet two men in the hotel. One of them was Pastor Graham, and the other man, Kevin realized, was a stranger. They went into a room together, and the hotel doors closed behind them. Kevin stood still, his heart pounding wildly. He didn't know exactly what was happening, but he felt it was more than just friendship or spiritual activities. He needed to know more. So, he decided to do whatever it took to find out what was going on in that room. He approached the hotel and cautiously started gathering information. At the reception was a young woman who didn't pay him much attention. Kevin quietly asked, "Which room is number 204? It's important." The woman looked at him with suspicion but replied, "It's room 204, but I can't give you access. Only for money." Kevin took out $200 and placed it on the table, after which he received the room key. Kevin approached the room and saw what lay on the floor. It was a black ribbon, wrapped in a small packet. He picked it up and immediately sensed that this wasn't just a meaningless object. The ribbon was tied in a special way, resembling a magical symbol. He carefully walked to room 204, avoiding drawing attention, and stopped at the threshold. He glanced again at the ribbon and the packet it was wrapped in. Then, carefully inspecting the room, he noticed a strange amulet on the table. The amulet looked like a symbol Kevin couldn't recognize, but its shape reminded him of ancient rituals. That's when Kevin realized this was no longer just about religion or friendship. This was something more. Something that went beyond simple human emotions and relationships. It was manipulation, rituals, and likely, his wife had fallen into a trap. Kevin couldn't let things continue as they were. Whatever this was, he had to find out the truth. He felt he couldn't rely on Sarah anymore, and so he decided to act on his own. This happened at night when most people had already gone home. So, he headed to the church, hoping to find some evidence that his suspicions were not in vain. The church was open 24/7, and Kevin knew this was his chance. He parked the car at a distance from the entrance to avoid drawing attention and headed for the doors. The entrance was through a side door, and he gently pressed the handle to check if it was locked. The door opened with a soft creak, and Kevin, feeling his heart race, quietly entered. In the dark hallway, a lamp illuminated small clothing cabinets and several ancient sculptures. Kevin moved quickly but cautiously, walking through the church and trying not to attract attention. He knew that if he was noticed, things could turn unpleasant very quickly. Pastor Graham had many followers, and even the slightest suspicion could lead to a major scandal. But Kevin wasn't thinking about the consequences. His goal was clear: to uncover the truth. When he surveyed the main hall, he realized the church was empty, just as he had expected. He decided to head toward the part of the building where, as he suspected, special records or other evidence might be stored. Clearly, the church had secret places where documents were kept, inaccessible to ordinary people. And there, at last, he found the stairs leading down. This was what he had been looking for. He cautiously descended into the basement, where he discovered a small, hidden room. The door was dark and forgotten, but when Kevin opened it, a small but well-lit space unfolded before him. It looked more like an office than a prayer room. In the corner stood a large library filled with books, some of which looked very old. But what truly caught his attention was something else. On the walls of the room were strange symbols Kevin had never seen before. They resembled pagan signs combined with religious imagery. Some were familiar, but others were completely incomprehensible. In the corner, several photographs caught his eye. These were the ones he had been searching for. Photographs of women Kevin didn't recognize. Among them was Sarah. The photographs looked innocently disturbing, and Kevin felt his heart tighten with anxiety. He held one of them up to the light, trying to inspect it more closely. It was Sarah's photograph, clearly taken without her knowledge. She looked just as she always did, but she was surrounded by other women, each one seeming to be connected to something greater than just religious gatherings. Kevin began to search for more evidence, and amidst a pile of old papers, he found a diary. It was Pastor Graham's diary. Kevin carefully opened it and began to read. The entries were very personalized, detailing each woman who attended the church. And as he flipped through the pages, he came across an entry about Sarah. Sarah, beautiful, but also a strong personality seeking spiritual enlightenment. Her intense inner world requires a special approach. She opened up to me after several meetings, and I see that she is on the verge of true enlightenment. Her devotion will define her path. She still has much to learn, and I am ready to help her discover the new horizons that await her. The entry also mentioned that Sarah was to repay Pastor Graham with her youth and beauty. This was something very ambiguous. Kevin felt his cheeks burn with anger and humiliation. Pastor Graham wasn't just leading people in the church. He was manipulating them, exploiting their weaknesses for his own goals. But this entry, his description of Sarah, sounded like some kind of promise. Kevin couldn't even imagine what it meant, but the fact that the pastor had so thoroughly analyzed each of the women promised nothing good. Kevin closed the diary and placed it back, trying not to leave any traces. He couldn't allow this to remain unchecked. But now he knew more than he had wanted to. He now understood that this was more than just religion. It was something dark, something that had been manipulating his wife, and it couldn't be left unaddressed. He had to act, and the worst part was that he now had to decide how to do it without causing harm to everyone involved. Kevin quietly left the room and calmly exited the church, trying not to attract attention. He only had one question on his mind. What now? With all these discoveries? Kevin woke up early the next morning, feeling like he had no choice. He had to learn more about what was happening in this church. The previous day's discovery had left a bitter aftertaste, and his curiosity wouldn't let him sit quietly at home. He decided to dive deeper. Opening his laptop, Kevin began to browse the church's social media. His goal was to find any information that could confirm or disprove his suspicions. Searching through old posts, he came across a comment that made his heart race. It was from a man who had once been part of the community. He wrote that the church was hiding shocking things unrelated to religion and that he could no longer remain silent. The message was brief, but the man promised to have important information. Kevin didn't hesitate. He immediately wrote to the man in a private message, asking to learn more. A few hours later, the man responded, agreeing to meet. He wrote that they could meet in a cafe on the outskirts of town, where they could talk without unwanted ears. Kevin knew this was the opportunity he had been waiting for. Gathering his thoughts, Kevin drove to the meeting spot. He couldn't help but worry. This was his only chance to learn the truth. He parked his car and entered the cafe. At a table sat a man who looked about 50. His eyes were slightly bloodshot, and his expression was serious. Kevin sat across from him and studied his face carefully. "You want to know the truth?" the man asked, a look of serious despair in his eyes. "Yes," Kevin replied, not taking his eyes off him. "I already know something's wrong. My wife is involved with this church, and I want to understand what's going on." The man sat silent for a few seconds, considering whether to speak. Then, he took a deep breath and began. I was a member of this church a few years ago. At first, everything seemed normal. But over time, I realized that we, the members of the community, were being manipulated. It was much worse than we thought. Pastor Graham didn't just preach. He controlled our lives. And this wasn't just a religious community. It was a club where each of us had our role. Kevin sat silently, listening intently to every word. He didn't know what to think, but he felt that this was confirming his suspicions. My wife, the man continued, was one of those who got involved in these games. And it's not just about spirituality. The pastor made women betray their husbands to achieve some spiritual results. He manipulated us, urging us to sin. I couldn't take it anymore. Kevin felt his heart tighten in fear, but he knew this conversation was far from over. How do you know it's really true? Kevin asked. The man pulled a bag from his pocket and placed it on the table. Inside were old letters and video materials stored on separate phones, things Kevin couldn't even begin to imagine. The letters had been written by Pastor Graham, and the videos were recordings of moments when the churchwomen were doing what the pastor had asked of them. One of the videos showed a woman cheating on her husband, with the pastor watching and giving instructions. Kevin felt cold sweat running down his back. It's true, the man said. I received these recordings before I left the church. I thought I could help stop all this, but it turned out to be much more complicated. Kevin took the letters and the videos and placed them in his bag. These were the pieces of evidence he could use to stop it all, but he still didn't know what to do next. He had a plan, but every step he took would be crucial. What are you going to do with all this evidence? The man asked, looking at him with concern. I'll find a way to use it to my advantage, Kevin replied, already thinking about how to make it all work. I won't let this continue. The man nodded, and they parted ways. Kevin knew that his life would never be the same again. He now had proof that his wife had been part of something much darker than he had ever imagined. Now there was only one thing left to do. Make sure to save Sarah from this trap, which she likely could not escape from easily. The next day, Kevin couldn't shake the anxiety that had gripped him when Sarah began talking about the church again. But this wasn't just a casual conversation. She was mentioning more frequently the services being held in their home, and she began referring to some vague details that unsettled him. He was sure there was something more going on than just religious activity. And today, she asked him to leave the house. I need you to go to your parents today, Sarah said, almost emotionlessly. We're having a service at home, and I need to spend the night with people from the church. You don't want to be a bother, do you? Kevin started thinking. She had always been open with him, but today something was off. There was something in her gaze, in her behavior that raised his suspicions. Why didn't she suggest simply spending the night together? And why now was she so insistent that he leave? Maybe I'll stay? He tried to smooth things over, but Sarah was determined. You know this is an important service. She didn't look at him, her eyes focused on something beyond him. You don't want to get in the way of me or the others, do you? She phrased it in such a way that it made him feel like any attempt to stay home would appear selfish. Kevin understood that if he wanted to uncover the truth, he had to follow his instincts. He decided not to argue. So, without saying another word, he began packing his things. However, as he was walking past the bathroom to grab his things, he noticed Sarah starting to get dressed. She wasn't wearing anything special, but there was something strange in her movements. Kevin watched through the open door, not daring to intervene. At first, she put on something soft, light, and elegant, and very beautiful, delicate lingerie. The black stockings with seams on her legs gave her a look that was both romantic and refined. Then she picked up a nun's costume. This was something more than just service attire. It was clearly not for preaching, but rather seemed more like a role play for lovers. His heart tightened when he realized that the costume had been altered to give the impression of a dirty game that Sarah had clearly prepared. Meanwhile, Sarah started painting her lips bright red, which contrasted sharply with her pale face. Everything seemed like part of a ritual, her appearance, her mood, and all of this was happening right in their house. Kevin could feel his unease growing. Wordlessly, he left the house without saying goodbye and got into his car. His head was full of thoughts. What was this? Was Sarah really cheating on him? Or was this another one of the manipulative moves connected to Pastor Graham and his rituals? Kevin couldn't leave it unanswered. He needed to find out the truth, and he wouldn't stop until he got it. He sat behind the wheel, running possible scenarios through his mind. Sarah had changed a lot, but was she really cheating? Or was this part of some manipulation? And why was it all connected to the church? His heart raced faster, and his fingers gripped the wheel tightly as he drove toward their house. Kevin stopped at a distance from the house, watching the door. It seemed like this would be no ordinary night. He needed to not just watch but be ready for whatever he might see. What if he really started observing Sarah and her service? Would those people from the church be there, the ones she had mentioned? And why was Sarah so faithfully following Pastor Graham's instructions? Over the next few hours, Kevin stayed at a distance, constantly watching his home. He waited to see who would arrive. The process of observation was like checking the smallest details. His eyes caught every movement, every gesture, even as the night became dark and silent. Soon, Kevin noticed a few cars pulling up to their house. Sarah opened the door for a few people, and at that moment, his heart almost stopped. These were the same people he had seen before when his wife had attended church. They greeted her like an old friend, hugging and laughing. Now Kevin realized, this wasn't just a night of worship. It was a night that could turn out to be the beginning of something much worse. He couldn't leave it like this. He couldn't allow himself to be deceived again. Kevin watched them until he finally got out of the car. He couldn't wait any longer. Today, he would learn the truth. Kevin sat in the car, his hands on the steering wheel, watching the house through the windshield. Time passed and everything seemed normal. A few cars with people going into the house. But with each new person, Kevin felt the pressure on his shoulders growing. He couldn't understand why his wife was becoming more and more involved in this. Music, whispers, strange smiles, everything felt suspicious. But he still hoped that something would change, that he would see some clue that would confirm his suspicions. Suddenly, strange sounds began to come from the house. These weren't just voices. Kevin heard voices that sounded strange, like prayers or magical incantations, mixed with quiet sounds he couldn't understand. This made him act. He couldn't just sit and watch anymore. It was time to learn the truth. Kevin got out of the car and quietly approached the house's door. As he got closer, he noticed that the door was slightly ajar, and that was his chance. He cautiously stepped inside. It was dark inside, only dim light from the lamps. He heard loud music coming from another room. People were laughing, talking, and everything seemed like they were in a strange state of mind. Kevin found himself in the hallway and decided not to waste time on details. There were many people in the rooms, but each one seemed so detached from reality, as if they were in another world. They didn't pay attention to him, didn't look his way, didn't seem surprised by his presence. Everyone appeared lost in their own thoughts, disconnected from reality. As Kevin walked past the rooms, he noticed he couldn't find Sarah. She wasn't in the rooms where other people had gathered. He decided to go upstairs. He heard Sarah's voice coming from the corridor. She was shouting something. Kevin listened carefully, and his heart tightened with anticipation. Approaching the door of their bedroom, he cautiously looked through the crack. In that moment, he saw something he could never have imagined, even in his worst nightmares. Sarah was in their bed, but this wasn't just her appearance. Pastor Graham was there with her. Their bodies were entwined in a passionate embrace, and Sarah was betraying him with such fervor that Kevin couldn't believe his eyes. Kevin's body went cold, and his heart pounded so hard that he thought he was about to collapse. His wife, his dear Sarah, was cheating on him, and she was doing it with a man he trusted more than anyone. But that was back when he didn't know the whole truth. Pastor Graham, the very man who had once been his moral authority, his mentor, was now a part of this nightmare. Kevin couldn't stand by anymore. He felt his blood begin to boil with rage. At first, he decided to quietly gather evidence. Kevin pulled out his phone and started taking photos and videos through the crack in the door. Sarah and Graham didn't even notice he was filming them. They were too absorbed in each other, and it was tearing him apart. Kevin couldn't wait any longer. He decided he had to do this right now. His legs were shaking from emotion, but he kicked the door, and it swung open. The whole scene before him became even more real, and in that moment, Kevin couldn't control his anger. "How could you?" he shouted, his voice filled with pain and despair. How could you betray me right in our bedroom with this pastor? You betrayed me? Sarah immediately froze, her face changed, but she couldn't say anything. She just stared at Kevin as if he were a stranger. Pastor Graham, ignoring the situation, tried to calm the scene. Kevin, you don't understand, he started. But Kevin didn't let him finish. No, I don't want to listen. Kevin screamed, trying to gather his thoughts. How could you do this? You taught my wife this. How could you use your position to manipulate people? How could you disrespect me like this? Sarah sat silently on the bed, her eyes filled with sadness and shame. She couldn't answer these questions. She didn't know how to explain what had happened. It was impossible. But Kevin couldn't stop. His heart ached from the betrayal, from the fact that he hadn't noticed what was going on all this time. I'm recording everything, Kevin said, pressing the video button on his phone. Now I have all the evidence. You won't be able to hide this. Sarah got up from the bed, her movements slow and uncertain. She approached Kevin, and her voice was soft but broken. Kevin, I was stubborn. I don't know how it all happened. I didn't know what to do. But Kevin no longer listened to her. He couldn't accept any of her explanations. The one who had been his support had turned out to be the one who betrayed him the most. Kevin stood there, unable to believe what he had just heard. His mind couldn't process the avalanche of information that had just hit him. Sarah, his wife, the one he had spent many years with, the one he loved and trusted, was now standing before him, telling him about her affair with Pastor Graham. Not only did she show no regret, but she also justified her actions, claiming it was something that had to happen, that this was how she had discovered new horizons. You don't even understand, Kevin? Sarah tried to explain, but her words sounded empty, like hollow echoes bouncing off the walls. Pastor Graham showed me how everything in life can be different, how I can open up and be real, how we can live without limits, without fear of judgment from others. Kevin couldn't listen to her anymore. His heart was breaking with anger from the betrayal he had just learned. Sarah continued, oblivious to his distress. I don't regret it, Kevin. It wasn't just betrayal. It was something more. I couldn't have done it any other way. Graham showed me that this was the only path to true freedom. You don't even know the limitations I was burdened with before I met him. Kevin felt his nerves begin to tear. He couldn't understand how this had happened, how she could take such a step, not only betraying him but justifying it. This wasn't just a mistake. It was a system, and his wife, who had once been his support, now seemed like part of this dark game. And then Pastor Graham began gathering his things, realizing the situation had gotten out of control and that he needed to leave the house. Quickly collecting his things, he headed for the exit, not caring about leaving his past behind. Kevin couldn't bear watching the man he had once respected simply run away. He hadn't even tried to respond to his questions. It was too easy for him to just leave when everything was clear. He watched as the pastor left the house, feeling like a deceived fool left alone with the deception. This is all a lie, Sarah. Kevin finally broke out, his voice filled with rage and disappointment. You had no right to do this to me. And Graham had no right to manipulate people like this. Sarah just stared at him, without any excuses, without tears. Perhaps she didn't see anything wrong with it because, for her, it was all part of some greater truth that Kevin couldn't understand. This had to happen, she said quietly, shifting the focus of her words. It opens the door to a new life. I know you don't understand me now, but one day everything will be clear. I didn't betray you for pleasure. It was a higher calling. This feeling was the final straw for Kevin. He could no longer endure it. His soul was drowning in pain, and he knew he would never forgive her for what she had done, even if she couldn't understand the magnitude of what had happened. Kevin stood, holding the phone that was still recording everything happening in the room. He looked at his wife, his face frozen in despair. He realized that it was time to do something about the situation. You can't just leave it all like this, he said in a cold voice. I won't tolerate your betrayal. I will find a way to make sure everyone knows the true face of Pastor Graham, and yours too. Kevin didn't know exactly how it would all unfold, but he was determined. His betrayed wife and the pastor, who turned out to be a manipulator pushing women into such relationships, had to answer for everything. He couldn't let them get away with it. Betrayal should not go unpunished, and Kevin knew he had to make it public. He left the room, gathered his things, and headed to the place where he could start acting. He couldn't allow Pastor Graham to stay in the shadows, and Sarah to live in her world of illusions. This was the moment when everything needed to change. Kevin sat in an empty room, contemplating what he should do. His heart was broken, but the anger and desire for revenge had already taken over. The situation was clear. His wife had betrayed him, and not just that, but with Pastor Graham, the man he had once trusted. His love and faith in the church and his wife had now shattered into pieces that Kevin had to force himself to endure. Step by step, he planned his revenge. First, Sarah. He decided he needed to end this union, and not quietly, not in private conversations, but publicly, so everyone could see and know what had happened. He concluded that betrayal could not be left unpunished. Sarah had to understand why everything had ended like this, and others had to see her true face. One morning, Kevin returned home and, without giving any warning, told Sarah he had decided to divorce her. She stared at him in surprise, her face filled with shock and disbelief. "Kevin, you can't be serious," she said, trying to approach him. "I'm serious, Sarah," he replied coldly. "This isn't just a divorce. I'm kicking you out of the house. You have no right to stay here after what you've done. You betrayed me, you betrayed our family, and that can't be ignored anymore." Fear appeared in her eyes, but Kevin could no longer feel sorry for her. This was the moment when he decided to take control of his life, to cast her aside, and no longer allow her to manipulate him. He took his phone and recorded a video where he announced the divorce and kicked her out of the house, which became a public declaration. He posted the video on social media, where everyone could see and hear his decision. Everyone who had been with her in church now knew about her betrayal. Kevin didn't just break up with her. He made sure she was humiliated and could no longer find support among the people she had deceived. Sarah appeared stunned, trying to explain her position, but her words had no power. She packed her things and left the house, leaving behind only emptiness and pain. Kevin stood, looking at the empty space, feeling anger but also a sense of relief. This was the first step in his revenge, and he felt he had made the right decision. Now it was time for Pastor Graham. Kevin knew that his next move would be even harder. Pastor Graham was the one who had compromised everything. His church, his family, his wife. Kevin couldn't allow this man to continue manipulating people. He gathered all the evidence he had, letters, videos, photos, showing how Pastor Graham used his spiritual power to lead women into betrayal and blatant moral violations. Kevin decided that he had to act publicly. He went to the church, where everyone was already gathering for the service. As soon as he entered, people started looking at him in surprise, not knowing what he would bring today. Without hesitation, Kevin went up to the pulpit and played a recording that showed Pastor Graham manipulating women, asking them to break their vows before God, conducting unauthorized rituals unrelated to religion. The people in the hall froze. They couldn't believe their eyes, but the video left no room for doubt. "This is the man you trusted," Kevin said. "This is the pastor who not only betrayed his church, but also used his position to manipulate others. And I can't allow him to be among us anymore." It was a shocking revelation. Everyone in the hall felt something clash with their beliefs. They didn't know how to react, and many started whispering. Kevin walked closer to the stage, pointing at Pastor Graham, who was sitting there, pale and stunned. "You no longer have the right to be among us, Graham," Kevin said. "You're not a pastor, you're a deceiver. I will prove that you used your position for personal gain." Graham stood up, not knowing what to do. He understood his time had passed. People began leaving the church, many of them unable to believe that their pastor had been like this. But the evidence was enough for everyone to see the truth. Pastor Graham, with a red face, was about to leave when Kevin, not giving him a chance to say anything, turned to everyone. "I won't let him stay here. Let this deceit continue. He must be expelled and removed from the church." The church fell into silence. People began leaving, and only Kevin remained, watching as Pastor Graham left the building. Kevin stood in the empty church, feeling a sense of inner relief. He knew he had made the right, though painful, decision. Sarah and Pastor Graham no longer had control over his life. He was ready to let go of the past and move on, even if it meant leaving everything he knew behind. He sat on a bench in the church, feeling the weight but also a sense of release. Now, after everything that had happened, he could begin a new chapter of his life. What would you do if you found out that your church wasn't a place of salvation, but a shelter for dark rituals and betrayals? What would you do if your pastor became a traitor and manipulator? Write your thoughts in the comments.